bit over. You missed an incredible opening ceremony and session. We all know that the crisis that we face is an intersecting crisis. When the IPCC, the International Climate Scientists, released their report a couple of years ago, they ended it with a sentence which has struck with me. Change is now inevitable. The only question is, what kind of change? And I think for us as movements, there's an added line, and who pays the price? And what this panel, and with our incredible guests here, are going to be looking at is how do we put justice into the just transition to ensure it's not only sustainable, but equitable. It creates and produces the economies that center equality and justice. And we know that many of these current debates neglect so much of this question. They neglect the structural interconnections between climate and the economy. They neglect the reality of people's everyday and ordinary needs, of workers, of jobs, of livelihoods. They talk about transitioning economies simply about transitioning a material throughput, when we know that what we need is a more fundamental and deeper and systemic transformation of our economies and of our societies. But that has to be done on an equitable basis. We can't transition the global north on the back of the global south. So we're joined with this panel today. We have Tejal Kanitkar, who's a IPCC climate scientist, author, climate scientist, and also at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in India. We have Nnimmo Bassey, who's the Director of Health of the Mother Earth Foundation. We have Sabrina Fernandes, who's from the Ecosocial Pact of the South. We have on screen with us Julia Steinberger, who is also an IPCC author, activist, academic, and one of the leading voices around degrowth and sustainable economies. And we also have Wrack, who needs very little introduction, who is the General Secretary of the Brigades Union, one of the leading trade unions in the UK that has been at the forefront of arguing for a justice transition. And Matt, in his spare time, is also the president of the TUC at the moment. So we're really delighted to have this panel. The way we're going to do it, I'm asking all of the speakers to make a contribution, and then I will open it up for any questions and contributions from the floor. So I'm going to start with Tejal, because often when we talk about climate science, we all know there's this thing, 1.5, we have it, it's meant to be the guardrail, and yet often our conversations, particularly in the global north, are around net zero 2050. So over to you, Tejal.
Thank you.
Yeah, it should do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Asad, and I'm very happy to be here. And it's a little difficult to sort of start with a specific question of climate change after that wonderful session in the morning, where I think we are confronted with so many immediate challenges. This one is also an immediate challenge, but it seems a little far away when people are dying in front of our eyes, right? So, but let me sort of bring myself together and get into it. We do have a crisis that we are facing today. It's not just in the future that we are facing today. We see an increasing number of extreme events, increasing intensity of extreme events, and devastating impacts of those events all across the world, felt much more severely in developing countries, felt much more severely by the working masses across all countries. Right? The resilience of to withstand these impacts are not equitably distributed. Not equitably distributed between countries and within countries. And the responsibility of why this is happening, the reason for why this is happening, is also not equitably distributed across countries and within countries. Right? So we have a huge amount of historical responsibility of developed countries. It's a fact. It's not something that is very often And let me just correct you, Asad, I'm not an IPCC author. I do negotiations on the IPCC reports, but I'm not an author. Very often, I think a lot of times when we think of science, and the IPCC reports in the global north are considered as science, and there is a lot in those reports that I think is very useful, that we must use. We do too in our part of the world. But when you start speaking about socio-economic projections, social and economic realities, these are contested issues. These are not simply matters of numbers. So when the IPCC report says you need 43% reductions by 2030 and net zero by 2050 to ensure that we limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are assumptions behind those numbers. And those assumptions are, let me just briefly tell you where that 43% number comes from. It comes from an assumption that sub-Saharan Africa will reduce its emissions by 80% by 2030. 80% reductions from already a very small amount of emissions in sub-Saharan Africa, but in the next 8 years, it's going to reduce by 80%, whereas Europe and North America will only do 50%, which they've already promised in their nationally determined contributions, right? So models that project the future, mostly built in the global north, right? Over 90% of the scenarios are from models in the global north. Of the 21 models used in the IPCC for these emissions projections, 20 come from developed countries. Only one comes from a developing country, right? So you have an assumption like this, where the developed countries are not expected to do anything more than what their governments are already committing to do. Whether or not they'll do even that much is, of course, up for, it's anybody's guess. But Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, two of the poorest parts of the world, are expected to do much more. Latin America is expected to reach net zero in some scenarios by 2030, right? So the entire expectation is that 1.5 degrees Celsius can only be achieved on the backs of the global south, with continued fossil fuel use even beyond 2050 in the global north. And when this is challenged, we are told, but it's not pragmatic to assume that, Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, the incomes or energy consumption is going to catch up to the global north anytime soon. It's not pragmatic to assume that there'll be poverty eradication. But it's pragmatic to assume that we will remain poor for the rest of the foreseeable future. That part of the world will remain in perpetual poverty just to ensure that, the North Star, John Kerry called it the North Star, 1.5 degrees Celsius at the last COP, that North Star remains well and alive, comes at the cost of lives, livelihoods, and futures, aspirations of the global south. Right? And this is something that is not acceptable. Not one of the scenarios that the IPCC uses, not one of them has full poverty eradication. Not one of them meets even the sustainable development goals. The only goal that you have is not the 43% reduction. You also have a commitment by countries to sustainable development goals. What happened to those? What happened to goals of poverty eradication? So it is important that when we have this conversation, global inequality, historical injustice, historical responsibility are always on the table. And it's simply not acceptable that you're told that equity is not pragmatic. Talking about equity somehow distracts. If we say, especially developing countries, when they make this argument for equity, even governments or civil society make this argument for equity, they're often told that this is a distraction from the urgency of the climate crisis. Right? The urgency of the climate crisis makes the conversation about equity even more urgent, not less urgent. It's more urgent, it's more necessary to talk about equity today more than anything else, right? And this entire focus, science is also produced in the social economic systems that we live in, right? So we have, we have to understand that what it means, it's extremely important. We know about climate change also because of science. But this entire focus on net zero, right? What the net zero means, of course, is that you're putting a lot of focus on carbon dioxide removal. Most of it, more than 80% of it, sometimes about slightly less, about 70% of it, in the global south. So it's the forests of Latin America, the forests of South Asia, and the forests of Africa that are to be the sinks for fossil fuel emissions, oil and gas emissions, and coal emissions of the global north, right? This is the assumption. And this threatens food security. We have academics coming to our countries from the global north saying, what happens, you know, we've created a scenario where all of India grows millets, or where all of India, or there's so much of land that is converted for energy crop production. What happens to food security? Isn't that no longer on the agenda? We are no longer supposed to worry about the fact that we need to feed people, that we need energy for people, that we need to have access, we need to have schools, we need to have hospitals, we need to have roads. These are material requirements. It's not simply going to be enough to say that, all right, we'll do these bunch of scenarios sitting in our elite institutions in the global north, put them into the IPCC report, and then we'll have a discussion about what kinds of financial transfers are required to achieve this. Right? So you say that you keep a large part of the global south poor first. Right? Energy poverty is a requirement for meeting the climate crisis. And then you say, okay, we'll pay you some money so that you remain poor. So that, you know, you keep on promising us that you'll remain poor, and we'll pay you some money for it by using your forests, using your resources as our sinks. That is simply not acceptable unless we put the question of equity, of historical responsibility, of global inequality on the table across all forums, not just in our political discussions, not just in gatherings like this, but in our academic institutions, in our academic discussions, in policy discussions at different fora. We are not going to be able to solve the crisis, because by trying to solve the crisis in the way in which it is envisaged today, you will just create a bigger crisis. And the IPCC code that you said, I think what I remember from it, from the Working Group 2 report of the IPCC, is that we must create a livable world, right? The chance to create a livable world is fast closing. But a livable world for whom? It can't be a livable world for a small minority in the global north, even a minority even within the global north. It's not even for the working masses of the global north, right? So if it is a livable world for everybody, then we need to have different discussions, different models, and different approaches to the way in which we think about the future.
Thank you, Tejal. So I want to turn to Nnimmo, because of course the climate crisis is entwined with the crisis of our collapsing ecosystems, of our relationship both to nature and other living beings, and some of the issues that Tejal raised in terms of both about the carbon markets, carbon sinks, but also now increasingly the techno fixes that are being promoted as the only way to reach these goals. I wonder if you could talk about that, Nnimmo.
Thank you very much. That was really a very good grounding on the basis of what we're going to be talking about. And thanks for the opportunity to share on this panel. One of the things that always comes to me when climate justice or climate change discussions are held is about negotiations, about the whole issue of talking about net zero in the future. Net zero by 2030, net zero by 2050, by 2060, by 2070. Policymakers and governments make those commitments as though they would be around by 2070 to make it happen. And so those kind of pledges have very basic intergenerational connotations. And you don't have the children on the table. They're not even consulted when these decisions are being made. And it calls to question the lack of reflection on the root causes of the crisis that we're facing today. This is the very reason why we have techno-fixes. For example, geoengineering, solar radiation management, getting the ocean to absorb more carbon, creating albedo effect by possibly genetically engineering crops or trees to have white leaves, or genetically engineering trees to absorb more carbon, to have more intense photosynthesis, or placing mirrors in the skies or sunshades. You know, all about thinking that what is broken can be fixed through technology. Technology still has a role to play. But what is really broken is our relationship with each other and with nature, with Mother Earth. It's because of this way of thinking that is so based on binaries, classifications, good versus bad, black versus white. They're not as simple as that. The opposite of white is not black. The opposite of good is not bad. It's much more nuanced and much more deep to look at this kind of relationships. But the way we think has separated us, made us felt like we are okay. We can stand far apart and we're not part of nature. We are the otherness classification. The others can be sacrificed. So you have the expansion of sacrifice zones, no matter what kind of transition we're talking about. And this is why I believe very strongly that the system change we need will not be negotiated. The system change we need will be built on the streets, be built by mobilizations, will be built through solidarity, will be built by a changing of our mentality, the way we think, the way we relate to each other, the way we see ourselves. Personally, if you ask me who are you, if you come to my community and you ask me to identify myself, I'll tell you I'm a son of the soil. Being a son or daughter of the soil immediately connotes the fact that I'm part of the environment. Now, I would see myself as a son of the soil before I see the other geographies, a son of coming from Africa, or being a migrant in Europe or somewhere else. The fundamental me is connected to the earth. And because we don't see ourselves as fundamentally connected to a common territory, then we're divided by geographies. We're also divided the way we go to negotiations. We go to negotiations to avoid responsibility, to avoid action, and to do what is convenient. And convenience and greed is driving the world to the brink. And this is what we need to tell ourselves. We need to find out, you need to come to a point where we agree that it's okay to say that overproduction, overconsumption, accumulation of capital, and all that is breaking, causing species extinction, breaking all the limits. But we also have to basically consider, who are we? What makes it possible for rich nations to invest trillions in warfare, to destroy resilience, and not invest millions for climate action, for climate finance? What makes it so easy to budget such heavy, horrendous amounts and sit down and watch the destruction of Gaza, for example, at a time we need resources to build resilience, to build capacity to withstand the coming storm? It's all because we believe that we are exempted from what is coming. And this is fundamentally defective and faulty. I believe that we need to learn from indigenous communities around the world, from the global south, global north, because they have a common understanding that needs to be shared. We hear about good living, where buen vivre, we hear about Ubuntu, we hear about in Africa, Harembe, also in Africa. And in my culture, we talk about etuwem. Etuwem means the good life, the same as we hear from Latin America and elsewhere. And that life connotes living within limits. It's not about accumulation of capital, it's not about accumulation of power, it's not about techno fixes. It's about fixing our relationships so that when we go to negotiation table, it becomes a table for conversation. How do we pull together? How do we come away together to a common future that we dream together? Not a future that somebody dreams in the laboratory. It's a future we dream from inside our heart. Our being first is internal before it becomes external. And if we all know who we are, it's easy to hold hands and work together. And I believe that this festival, so properly called, is a time to learn to dance together. a time to learn to work together, a time to learn to see the climate catastrophe as something that we all have personal obligations to stand together in solidarity, not separated by deserts and the ocean, to hold those who are holding the levers of power in rich nations accountable and bring them to the understanding that what the change we need is going to be so fundamental and so revolutionary in terms of being a change of how we relate to one another, in terms of how we know who we are, our being itself, and how we work together. I think this is where I want to contribute as a necessary pause to reflect on who we are, where we're going, and what we want to see. The thing that would birth decolonialism, including coloniality, which persists across the regions in the world.
Thank you, Nnimmo. And many of our movements and networks, of course, have taken up that challenge, is thinking about what is the economies that we're trying to build? What are the relationships? Apologies. And nowhere more so than through the Ecosocial Pact. And Sabrina, I wonder if you can maybe share some of the thinking that is being laid out of a pathway that is able to meet those needs, both of equity and of justice, of the right of people to live well lives, dignity, meet their material needs, but also in balance and in harmony with our planet. Sabrina.
Thank you, Asad. Good morning to everyone who's here today. Just because Nnimmo just mentioned colonialism and we have a big banner over there that says climate justice, not colonialism, I think this is really important. So we understand that if climate justice is not colonialism, it's because climate catastrophe is colonialism and is deeply embedded in a system that is renewing itself, that is going out through the creation of what we're calling green sacrifice zones, that is pitting people and interests are still shaped by capitalism against each other. And in Latin America, we're facing a lot of challenges around that because the model that's being posed from above through the net zero perspectives or through the techno fixes or the idea that you can kind of change things to fight climate change but then keep everything else about the same is going to work when in fact it's still going to replicate the same problem that we've had historically of benefiting and fixing certain things at the cost of others. And we talk about this in the sense of the global south, but I like to ground this in the notion of territory because when we're talking about territorial life and territorial rights, sometimes we're also discussing peoples and communities who wouldn't identify in the geopolitical sense with the global north and the global south division because we understand that center and periphery, we can kind of find that everywhere nowadays, right? And through these issues, it's become quite clear to us that in the race for critical minerals, so we're talking here not just about lithium, even though that's the one that pops up in our minds more often because of electrical vehicles, but we're also talking about cobalt, copper, manganese, and this is leading to patterns of displacement and new forms of what we're calling green colonialism throughout the world. So be it with indigenous communities being forced and pressured and also facing violence coming from governments, whether they're right-wing governments or progressive governments, saying that, well, weren't you complaining about climate change? Didn't you want us to protect nature? Well, now we need to grab this at all costs. And then, but we're listening to you. We're giving you some opportunities to public hearings and consultation schemes. There's like Convention 169 from ILO. So we are doing previous consultation, but it's not in good faith, as it's been established before. Because what is happening right now, and this is something for us to be quite aware in the conversation, as climate change becomes more common in the vocabulary, in the vernacular, in the media, and it's in the narrative streams, we need to understand that a narrative change is not necessarily a material change. Changing the narrative doesn't necessarily mean that we're changing power structures. And we're getting to a process of inclusion illusion in the way we approach the more vulnerable people or those communities that hadn't been heard before. Well, listening processes don't necessarily mean that power is shifting at all here. So the problem with the green capitalist narrative winning nowadays is also because green capitalism is kind of winning. It is creating new pockets of exclusion and destruction in many areas, and is normalizing new things. You might have heard that, for example, in Congo, we're talking about 6 to 7 million people displaced, and when you ask about it, they say, oh, conflict. There's conflict in the region. Aren't those people so full of conflict and armed conflict? But we're not really digging into what's the core of this. What are the power structures? Where is agribusiness involved? Where this is a race for specific minerals in the area as well, where we're talking about new carbon schemes for the forests of Congo too, and what it means to log sustainable wood and doing accreditation for the sustainable wood with blockchain. And then we get back into cryptocurrency, and that's also putting a toll in our pressure for renewables because, well, cryptocurrency is using a lot of electricity. We're going to use solar panels for that. We're going to use wind power for that. Meanwhile, we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of households without access to electricity in the world. In the end, what we have here is an issue around the first. Like, who gets to access something first? And then we need to rethink what we understand by democracy. And when we're discussing these gaps, these inequalities here, democracy could be the power to say yes, but you don't really have the power to say yes if you don't have the power to say no. And these processes of green colonialism, they are getting to communities, new areas where people are technically being heard. But if they say no, if they really say no, you can't go through here. You can't cross my territory. You can't build this new railway through the forest, or this is not where you're going to go through a lot of cables for a transmission line. What happens then? Then we should be creative. We need to find new ways around it rather than imposing this in the system. And one of the challenges that we're facing, and I think like Tatiana, who spoke in the first panel, was really good of like laying that out for us, is that we understand that there's a difference between being, for example, under an ecocidal government like we had in Brazil with Bolsonaro and going through a renewed progressive wave. But that doesn't mean that we need to cross our arms and just wait, well, this is at least better than what we had before. We can't just lower our standards like that. We can't lower the bar. So I think one of the invitation that we have with the Ecosocial Pact of the South, by talking about post-extractivism, trying to understand new ways of relating here, is that we can actually build solidarity, not just through campaigning or just convincing people that these other lives matter and these other perspectives, they matter, and we need to be respectful, but by understanding that, yes, we're actually all in the same boat, and we can find ways of living through sufficiency, living within limits. They are very pleasurable because we're not going to be measuring our lives against the same standards of fossil capitalism. We often hear that there's a problem when we mention in the global north, in the developed world, developed, quote unquote, here, about degrowth. Well, but that's such a bad word. You're not going to convince workers with that. When there's a possibility for us to actually understand the limits of the earth together with new ways of improving our lives that are not necessarily productivist. So when we limit ourselves to thinking that we're not going to convince workers unless we tell them they can get a Tesla or they can get, you know, electrical vehicles, and then can still have many TVs in their houses, we're limited ourselves to green capitalism. Even if we're doing this through organizing in labor unions, even if we're doing this with a socialist perspective. So our invitation from many communities around the world is like going from what Nnimmo was saying around good living here, is to escape this carbon tunnel vision, is to escape this decarbonization framework that's been very limiting for us because it's not allowing us to look into the impacts of the transition that normally gets reduced to the energy transition here, and to do so by trying to figure out ways where we can organize around care, where we can organize around communities and collective enjoyment. We can organize around education. We can organize around changing curriculum, because it's much easier to learn new things now than to actually have to retrain later on. And to do so in ways that we're not just listening to other voices, but we're respecting them enough to understand that they have power and true sovereignty to say no when they have to. And this is usually a really good perspective for us to take into these other spaces that might be more contradictory when we go to negotiations, when we're talking, when we're trying to face the world institutions, that it's not enough to finally be heard and, you know, maybe get a seat on the table if you don't get to call the shots.
Thank you, Sabrina. So this call about we're not just interested in cutting carbon, but also cutting injustice and thinking about sufficiency and ideas such as public luxury and private sufficiency. I wonder if I could bring in you, Julia, because often the argument, of course, is that this is not possible in the global north, that nobody will buy into that. And you've been one of the people who've been working a lot on, you know, envisaging those and thinking about what those strategies look like. Julia.
Thanks, Asad, and thanks, everybody. I am painfully aware that I am a big head somewhere in this room. I wish I could be with you. I was able to follow the opening ceremony, which was extremely moving. So it seems like really the right place to be. That being said, I'm also glad to be on a panel where I have points of agreement and disagreement with people as well. And so hopefully that'll allow discussion. I just wanted to say some things with respect to that. So answering some of the previous panelists to start with, I won't defend the IPCC or most of the climate models. They do entrench inequality in ways that are completely unjustifiable, you know, for decades into the future. But it is in fact true that there is one major scenario in the last IPCC report that does a decent effort that is represented as trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's based on a paper by Björn Sergel, and I think it's worth looking into because some of the recommendations are things that, for that particular paper and for that particular scenario to hold, are things that people in this room, I think, would be very much interested in and agree with. And I also think that it's really important to understand that we have an economy to some extent. Yeah, that I think this is something I'm really having a hard time explaining to people, so I'm going to try to explain it here very clearly. We have an economy that functions perfectly, based around the needs of industry. So this economy that we have, that is currently doing these ravages and pursuing a very destructive path, is really working as it was intended to do. It is not malfunctioning. It is working perfectly based on the needs of industry. And what the needs of industry are to have some kind of stability. That means that because they are constantly overproducing, they also need an economy that creates overconsumption for them. These industries also need inequality, because there are profits to be made when people are impoverished and can be exploited. And you can also push people into debt based on their needs. This is something that's happening very much in the UK, as Asad well knows, that you push privatization so that you can extract revenue from people's basic needs, and then you put them in debt, and then you make profits. There are to be made from overconsumption and luxury consumption and just plain unnecessary consumption. There's also a lot of neo-colonial exploitation, extractivism, devastation, as Sabrina mentioned as well. So what we have to understand is, I think we have to understand that we're facing a system that is not malfunctioning. It's just functioning really well for the wrong actors. And I think that means that's also something that we have to relearn, that our understanding of the way the economy functions is also something that was in fact pushed by industry. So the fossil fuel industry, this is little known, but it should be more known. The fossil fuel industry was actively engaged in pushing a certain form of economic education, in particular in the United States. But as we know, what starts in the US doesn't stay in the US. And they really saw this vision, this sort of what turned into neoliberalism, as essential for continued operations. That was so essential that they were really willing to invest a lot of money into just building an economics curriculum and an economics culture and understanding. So I think we have to understand that what the economy is currently made of is what these actors want, in particular what the fossil fuel industry and other extractive industries want. And when we want to counter that, I think we have to take seriously the fact that this is a well-functioning system that has taken decades to develop and that we're up against something really big. The second point I wanted to make is that changing the system is, at least technically, completely feasible. So I agree with pretty much everything that Nnimmo said, but I disagree with something, which is that we are at a magical technological age, not necessarily in terms of the technologies that are put forward for, the green growth transition. Those are rather devastating in a lot of cases and require far too much resource use. But in terms of technologies that are oriented towards decent living, we are in a rather magical age. We have technologies that allow people to live decent lives at much lower levels of resource use, energy use, no emissions than previously. And that can presumably only get better because we haven't even been really trying to do that. That's something that's just sort of a side effect of the current system. And so when you model what these new technologies, so existing technologies, would allow us to do in terms of delivering well-being or human needs satisfaction across the board, you find that, and that did in my Living Well Within Limits project, and that other people are doing as well, it must be said, including Narasimha Rao at Yale University, who's a real pioneer in this, is that the energy requirement of decent living standards is actually quite low. It's less than half of the energy that would be required now. This is a very ambitious scenario that has no inequality, okay? But it still tells us that it's possible to provide decent living conditions for everybody, but it's a very different development pathway. It's not the old development pathway. And this is probably where I disagree the most with Tejal, is that it's not a choice between the old development and being generalized to everybody and a net zero pathway or a pathway where we deal with climate change. We have to change what it means to provide good living conditions in our societies for everybody across the board, both in the global north and in the global south. And this is something that uniquely can be done now in a way that it couldn't be done before. But our economies are not at all on a track of realizing that, because they're on a track of increasing inequality, exploitation, deprivation, and very wasteful overproduction and overconsumption. We've learned a bit more about what it means to be able to reach the kind of economy where we would have human need satisfaction for everybody. So this is work done by Yefim Fogel, also Marta Baltrushevitz. We've actually studied societies where this kind of thing happens, where households where this kind of thing happens. We know that democracy is an important component. We know that one of the key linchpins is investment in public services, healthcare. So this public luxury is really public service, accessible, high quality, universal public service access is the thing that to square the circle between a just transition, equity, everybody having their needs satisfied, human sustainable development goals, and being able to reduce our resource use and to reduce our emissions. So public services are probably the most important factor there. And we currently have a project called REAL, a post-growth deal, where we're going to be looking much more into the role of labor and much more into the role of economic democracy. So who works where, how can we sort of change that into a sustainable future, a low resource use future, and a sufficient future. And we're also looking very much at economic democracy. So creating alternative forms of our economy that can transform it from a necroeconomics, to paraphrase Achille Mbembe, into something that is in fact the economy of life, that means that we have to do it. We can no longer let decisions around production, consumption, and investment be made far away. We have to take those decisions back in one way or another. And I think that that's probably the most important message that I would like to bring to today's gathering. And thanks so much for having me and accommodating me online as head.
Thank you, Julia. And this, I mean, I think many in the climate movement are finally listening to those of you in the climate justice movement that no transition is possible without understanding the realities of economic injustice, the rights of people to live with dignity, and that our movement has to have the labour movement at its centre. There is no transition without the labour movement being part and parcel of that, not separate but alongside and together. So this question often that is posed in terms of jobs, livelihoods, that I suppose was best captured maybe in the Gilets jaunes, yellow vest protests. The elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people worry about the end of the month. Has been one of the biggest questions within the Just Transition movement. And I know Matt, as the FBU, very much at the centre of trying to weave together a very different story about what the transition looks like. Over to you, Matt.
Well, Asad, is that working? Yeah. Okay, morning, friends and comrades. It's a great pleasure to be here and to listen to the other panelists. And I do want to take up those points of how do we build a movement that addresses the challenges globally that we face, but also addresses those particular concerns of working people here and internationally. And I suppose the example that people might use is of workers who are in organised workplaces, for example, are in parts of the energy sector who may see their jobs under threat. That's an obvious example, and who therefore may adopt policies which are against the interests of the majority because of their perceived view of their own short-term interests. And I think those are the things we've got to grapple with. I'm going to start with some examples of why for us, in my own particular union, this is an industrial issue, and then go on to some of our wider reflections on that. But just on that first point, in my own union, one of my predecessors back in the 1950s, we've always had quite a political education approach in the Fire Brigades Union, and he coined a phrase, you need to look beyond the fire station doors. So yeah, we're fighting for justice in our workplace, but there is a big wide world outside our workplace, and we can't not engage with that wider world. And that means taking an interest in the wider labour movement, but also in international issues as well. I just want to start with one example. In 2013, there was a fire in Arizona at Yarnell Hill, and 25 people in total died in that fire, including 19 firefighters. And let's remember, this is in the most powerful country in the world, in the United States. And every year, firefighters are killed in the United States tackling wildfires, which I think we don't need to have the debate here, are clearly linked to climate change and the growing climate catastrophe. Those 19 firefighters were members of a trade union, of the International Association of Firefighters, which is the biggest firefighter union in the world. So for us, in our industry, in our profession, this is already an industrial issue. The question of how you tackle extreme weather events is already a bread and butter health and safety issue for us. And you look at Australia, and I'm talking particularly about developed countries initially. You look at Australia, you look across Europe, every year there are extreme weather events where a large number of people die, and firefighters are on the front line of tackling that. Here in the UK, the extremes are not as severe, but you talk to firefighters today, the question of large-scale flooding, for example, is something that we are tackling today, which was not being felt 25, 30 years ago, 40 years ago when I joined the Fire and Rescue Service. So there are issues even here for organised workers in public services of how do we mitigate the impact of climate change even in the developed countries. So the question for us of does the fire service have enough boats to deal with floods, because at one point we were sending firefighters into floodwater wearing equipment that's designed to fight fires. So there's a very practical thing of we need boats, we need dry suits, we need training on how do you deal with water. These are issues that we can take into communities, because I've visited lots of communities who've been affected both by large-scale flooding and seen the devastation in Britain of that type of incident, and I've seen communities that have been devastated by large-scale heathland and moorland fires, which again are on a scale we've not seen before and affect the fire service on a huge scale in the United Kingdom. So, as I say, for us, this is already a very practical industrial issue that we're taking up with our employers, with governments. We're making a case to the potential future government about what they need to do about so-called resilience for communities facing these new and emerging risks. And that is a similar debate across much of the developed world where you have organised fire and rescue services. But the truth is, many countries don't have organised fire and rescue services in the way that we have here. There needs to be clearly a wider international discussion on that. And we've then taken that experience ourselves into our own discussions in our trade union, but also into the Labour Party, to which we're affiliated, and to the TUC, to which we are affiliated, to say we want to be part of a much wider discussion about how does the working class movement as a whole tackle this international challenge. How does the organised working class movement as a whole tackle the question of a transition? And I find it interesting on the question of a just transition, because I guess you won't find anyone anywhere saying they support an unjust transition. So I think we need to probe down a bit more what we mean by some of the terms that we use. I think for us there are huge class issues involved, both as some of the speakers have said, that the communities affected here worst are poorer, working class and poorer communities. And on a global scale, that is the inequalities are obviously far, far greater. So we talk about a flood here that where people may be injured or in some extreme cases killed. You look elsewhere in the world and hundreds, if not thousands of people are killed or injured in those type of incidents. So we have to raise that. So internationalism has to be part and parcel of this discussion. I think the question, equally, the other side of, for me, the class question is, yes, this is already and will disproportionately affect working people and the poorer people of the world. But the other side of that, which has been touched on to some degree in other contributions, is that there is another side of that class divide, the people who actually run things. And I would argue there's actually a complete incompatibility between a just transition and the system under which we currently live. The idea, in my view, that capitalist corporations are going to help us in a just transition, I think is naive. And we have to set out very clearly an alternative vision of what that means, which means placing power in the hands of ordinary people, transforming the economy, and that also, in my view, means taking the power out of the hands of other people, corporations, big business around the world, and so on. So I think as Asad said in introducing me, I think working people, the landless, the poor across the world have to be central to this discussion, to building new international movements. I don't have any great faith in, frankly, any of the governments of the world. I don't have any great faith in the United Nations to resolve these challenges. I think if we're going to change things, we are going to have to build, and there are the seeds of it, but it's not remotely on the scale that is needed. We're going to have to build a movement from the bottom up that actually sets our own agenda, takes advice from specialists and plots out alternative visions and alternative options, but actually builds that power from the ground up to create a very different world to the one that we live in today. And that's my perspective on the climate crisis and how we try to raise that issue within our trade union, in our education events, and into the TUC and other organisations that we have dialogue with. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So, because the opening ceremony ran over, we're trying to catch up a little bit, so we're going to have to truncate some sessions. But I do want to give people an opportunity if they have any questions before I come back on a couple of points. Noreen, will you mind just passing? Oh, thank you. This person here with the glasses.
Thank you very much. Just a very quick question. We talk about a just transition, and as Matt has mentioned, there's a definition here which is problematic in terms of what we mean by just. But I'm looking currently at what's happening in Europe in respect of the farmers and the opposition that they're mounting against top-down policies which are trying to be ecologically sound and to move us in a positive direction, but they're top-down measures, and that's producing a huge reaction of farmers and other people, working-class people in Germany, against some of the more progressive measures that we might in normal circumstances support. This seems to be a very dangerous development, and one in which the far right are benefiting from rather than progressive movements. So I'd just like welcome comments from the panel on this really dangerous turn in terms of what we mean by a just transition.
Thank you. I'll take Clara at the back as well. Take three and then.
Yes, thanks so much to the speakers and for this session, because I think that we've really got a challenge in reclaiming the term just transition. I'm a member of Unite the Union. We've clearly got big challenges in the UK with the thousands of job losses in Port Talbot, in Tata Steel, closure of Grandmouth refinery in Scotland with hundreds of job losses. And our trade unions have shut down the just transition debate to confine it to only the jobs of workers in those industry, people like me in the not-for-profit sector or health sector or local authority sector. We are not on the table. And I think we are missing a trick at the moment in the climate justice movement, is that not enough effort goes into building those relationships with unions. When we run campaign against Stop Rosebank or Stop the West Cumbria coal mine or the Stop East Africa crude oil pipeline, there is very little attention put to the sort of alternative economics. What are we for rather than what we are against? And dialogue with workers and unions. We must bring them on board and put more effort into that part of the just transition struggle.
Thank you. Take the one over.
Hi, I'm Gaurav. I'm a PhD researcher with the Tyndall Center. So this is maybe a question to Julia or Tejal, whoever wants to answer. So just coming back to, like Julia and Tejal mentioned about IPCC, and I also work on modeling. So this notion that when we talk about modeling, and then this point out particularly from researchers from Global North, is like this scenario is good, that scenario is good. When you talk about jobs, this is good. When you talk about well-being, that is good. But there is also this notion coming from Global South that we have to throw away, and it has to be pointed out, this scenario framework which IPCC is dependent on, and there is a need for an alternative framework. Because even when we talk about decent living standard, the decent living standard these scenarios are modeling are bare minimum. And particularly from Global South and where I come from, we do not aspire for that minimum standard. We aspire for more. And when we read these fancy papers in Nature and all, we don't see what our aspirations are reflected in that from modelers from Global North. So just a reflections on that. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to take one more, and then I'm going to, I'm trying to move block, so I'll take the lady there, and yeah, I'll take you. And wait for the mic.
Thank you. Okay, I'm from Fuel Poverty Action, and we've been working very hard to wed the fight against poverty and the fight against climate change together in this country. But we come to a conference like this for pointers, and we've had some, on how to do that also in relation to the Global South. We've been much less successful in making the demands of the Global South part of what we're fighting for here. And we have had some hints today, some useful, points about degrowth. I would add, I think it's very important to confront waste. I think it's easier for people to see the waste that is all around us and the expenditure on things we don't need, like the military, and say we want an end to that, than to say, okay, we want to degrow the things that they feel might be something that they actually need. So I think the concept of waste is quite important. But we've seen the reference to degrowth. But in specifics, here we have, there's some obvious answers in terms of housing, that we could cut down on the energy that we need massively by insulation. Yeah. But on minerals in wind turbines, solar from the desert, all the questions that people are asking about how we keep the lights on, if there are any pointers that you can give us, that would be really appreciated.
Go. And I'll take Moira at the back.
Voy a hablar en español.
Moira, in here we don't have interpretation.
No hay interpretación.
Oh, so she'll interpret for you.
Okay.
Moira, ¿quiere hablar y una pausa y yo explico a ellos?
Perfecto. Okay. Creo que primero saludo, vengo de la nación mapuche, al sur de la Patagonia.
Para todos. I'm greeting you. I come from the Mapuche nation at the south of Argentina.
Creo que la unidad debe construirse a partir del consenso.
I believe that there's unity to rebuild us through consensus.
No solamente el consenso sobre contra lo que luchamos, sino el consenso por lo que vamos a luchar.
Not just consensus against what we're fighting, but also consensus what we're fighting for.
Tenemos claro qué es lo que no queremos. Ahora tenemos que saber qué es lo que sí queremos.
We have it clear what we don't want, but we need to make it clear what it is that we want.
La nación mapuche tiene 14.000 años de historia, de lucha y de resistencia.
The Mapuche nation has 14,000 years of fighting and resistance.
Y hemos visto pasar sobre nuestros cuerpos y territorios muchos tipos de genocidio.
And we've seen go through our bodies and our territories many types of genocide.
Y hemos sobrevivido porque sabemos lo que queremos.
We have survived because we know what we want.
Queremos restablecer el orden cósmico, la vida en armonía con la tierra y en reciprocidad con todos los pueblos.
We want to reestablish cosmic order, life in harmony with the earth. La última parte.
El orden cósmico, restablecer el orden cósmico y la reciprocidad con la tierra y con todos los pueblos.
And reciprocity with the earth and all of the other peoples.
Entonces, me parece que algo fundamental es discernir en este momento histórico si una porción importante de la humanidad puede construir unidad en función de una nueva matriz civilizatoria.
So it seems to me that is a very important point, that if we can actually work towards building a new civilizational matrix.
Porque lo demás, las demás discusiones de los distintos tipos de crisis son mero entretenimiento. La crisis es civilizatoria.
Because if we don't do that, we will just be going through these different explanations around the crisis, when in the end, the crisis is a civilizational crisis.
Thank you. So there was a number of points there. I'm not going to choose which ones each of you asked, but I wonder if maybe you could pick out the ones that you think most relevant. So feel free. Do you want to go first, Tejal?
Yes, we have very little time, so let me just quickly pick out some of them. I think your question on, Gaurav's question on DLS, and this is something that goes to a little bit of a disagreement that I have with Julia too. There is a lot of literature is coming especially from northern scholars on decent living standards. But what are these for the global south? And across most papers, if not all of them, decent living in the global south is reduced to a bare minimum of poverty eradication, right? So you won't starve and you should be happy with that. You can't aspire to anything more than that. And that's simply not acceptable, even in terms of, what we demand, even if we understand what sufficiency would mean. I agree that there shouldn't be owning 3 SUVs in a family, etc. shouldn't be absolutely on the table. There is no space for that. There is no room for that. Right? So we need to talk about public transportation. We need to talk about the provision of public amenities and services. But we need to talk about the aspirations and human well-being. We need to talk about universal human well-being and what that means. And that simply goes beyond just poverty eradication. And we do need different models to be able to do this. Most of these, even the ones that attempt to sort of model sustainable development, don't get there because the entire framework is neoclassical in nature, which believes that you can have no redistributive justice. You can't make anybody better off by making somebody else worse off, which simply means that you can't, given the limited carbon space we have today, in a climate-constrained world, you can't make anybody who's not well off today any better off. That's simply an economic paradigm of modeling that is not given to any kind of justice, either for the present or for the future. So it's not enough to say that we have one IPCC scenario out of the 1,200 that at least talks about sustainable development. The very paradigm in which it is conceived denies equity and denies justice. So that needs to change. And I do think that for some of these things, new different paradigms, we need a political project, and that speaks to the question on farmers, on union struggles. It's not simply enough to have an academic understanding of what sufficiency is, of what we need to have in terms of a transition, but what is the political project for it? Do we have a political project? And for that, I think it is necessary to connect these issues, and there is no frontier that we must not fight on. You can't say that, no, I don't think the UN, the negotiations, etc., because whatever it is, even when you manage to achieve some successes, limited as they may be domestically, they are washed out by the project of imperialism, the project of colonization. So you must fight. You can't afford to give up any space for fighting. It needs to be fought at multiple levels, and I think it's, I'll hand it over to somebody else to pay, perhaps.
I'll touch on a couple of the points that were raised. On the I think a very important point about the farmers. I think it touched on the point Asad made in introducing about the Gilets Jaunes movement. I think and Trumpism, if you like. And I think we're dealing with the consequences of a decline in the traditional left, whatever you might think of that. A decline in the trade union movement. If you take the trade union movement in Britain today, it has just over 6 million members. 1979 had 12 million members. So the trade union movement has been through a significant decline here and elsewhere, as the traditional left parties, such as they were, have very clearly shifted. You can see that very sharply in the current Labour Party leadership, frankly, where, so I think the risks of that is that people will therefore look for other avenues, and it is staggering that people who I think should have a natural home on the left are looking elsewhere, and I think it's a fundamental strategic issue that we have to face up to. That point one. I think Clara made some point about the debate in the unions, and I just want to link that to the point that was made about from the comrade from Fuel Poverty Action about waste and the military and so on. I think one of the dangers in our movement that I come from, the trade union, is sectionalism, that people look very narrowly and sectionally at things. And I am currently the president of the TUC, so I'll be careful what I say, but last year's Trade Union Congress passed a motion, which I'm very proud that my union voted against, but we lost, which clearly linked the defense of defense jobs with a debate about Ukraine. I.e., it seemed to me, people were making the case we should build more bombs so that we can create jobs in the defence industry here. I find that quite a shocking position for the British trade union movement to adopt. And I remember as a young, where is the mass, we've got a huge movement on Gaza currently, where is the wider movement for peace and against militarism and against nuclear weapons? It seems the debate on nuclear weapons has almost disappeared from British politics. We need to reinvigorate, and certainly my own union has had a long stance of supporting nuclear disarmament and including unilateral nuclear disarmament. Those debates have been pushed to the side by the politics of the past three decades.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief. So first, I'm just going to do a little bit of a plug for our movement. So if you go online and you look for the Ecosocial Pact of the South, we have our Bogota Declaration, and we have a joint collective manifesto on what we understand as the just part of the energy transition. So there's a lot of stuff laid out there that was all built collectively with many movements from the regions, partners from outside of Latin America too. So I think that helps with some of those conversations and saves us time from here. A point on the unions that sometimes the workers are captured by reactionary ideology, because in the end, the far right is gaining ground, and this is an obstacle for all areas of organizing. So there's no way of fighting for climate justice without combating the far right on all matters. So this requires a really, really strong alliance and being very clear about this. Something that Matt said that I think is important is that there are some workers whose mitigation of climate change is a matter of life and death. It is, because their life is getting harder. But in the end, we kind of need to make this point for everyone so we can finally get out of this very unproductive division between workers and marginalized communities. Because workers are negatively impacted by climate change, no matter your area, unless you're talking about people who are really going up the chain, becoming part of the elite, and then they stop being workers. So if we get rid of this division, it's going to be easier to show how things are getting worse and how things could get better. And it's not just about building solidarity with another, it's all about all of us together. And just to finish, the reason why Zionists and empire are so afraid of BDS is not just because BDS can be very effective against apartheid in South Africa or in Palestine. It's because it does help us to think tactically. So think of boycott, divest, and sanctions when it comes to fossil fuels too. Think about that when it comes to the industrial military complex. And I think we can start building something very strategic from an international standpoint together.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Julia before to come to you, Nnimmo. Julia.
Thanks. I'll say a couple of things about the farmer protests. I think that we have to go back to Karl Polanyi in terms of economic thinking. And one of the things that he really showed in his study of the buildup of Nazi Germany is that when people have economic insecurity, they turn to fascism. And that's exactly what we're seeing around the world right now. So I think that that's one of the things that the just transition has to put at its absolute core. And I think it also goes to the comment of the person who spoke from the TUC. Care work and public services are the beating heart of an economy that enables democracy. Anything that fragilizes the livelihoods and economic security of people is going to lead to authoritarianism and fascism. This is something that we see over and over, and it should not become as a surprise to us anymore. And it means that the program that we build to counter that has to put economic security at the forefront in one way or another. In terms of decent living, this is a little bit inside baseball, but in terms of the discussion with Tejal and the person who asked the question from the Tyndall Center, I'm sorry I missed your name. The person who started decent living standards is a Global South scholar, Narasimha Rao, who's from India, working in Global North institutions. So I think that that's one of the things we have to take seriously. We have to take seriously the fact that he elaborated these standards and tried to implement them in terms of what they would mean for India, South Africa, and Brazil first. And I think that this can't be just dismissed. The decent living standards are very far from the poverty standards. They are above material anything above material deprivation. So they go far, far beyond poverty. And so I think it's just a mischaracterization to show it that way. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying we can't improve on it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to build in some level of, more if it's possible. That would be great. But the decent living standards have at their very core the satisfaction of human needs. These are things that can be considered universally. And I really would defend this approach because for the first time, it allowed us to measure what would be the resource requirements, the energy requirements for really bringing everybody, every single person in the world above this level of not just poverty, but into sort of a life that we could all recognize as maybe it's not the level of comfort that we have right now, maybe it's not the level of luxury, but it's something where we do not suffer in our life chances as a result of this. And so I think that this is just something that I would really appreciate if people recognized it, if they went and read the papers. I'm not going to defend IPCC modeling in general. We're trying to build other models, including ones that have north-south convergence, including ones that reduce international inequality, including ones that do delinking of sort of bad international relations, to put it simply, and ones that take into account what happens to labor. So I think that there's a lot of progress to be made, but I wouldn't just dismiss all the work that's being done out of hand. And I'm very sorry I can't spend the rest of the day in the discussion with you.
Thank you, Julia. Nnimmo.
Thank you very much. I fully agree that what we are in now is a civilizational crisis. And this requires that everyone should be ready to be inconvenienced. And then to ensure that we have a just transition, number one thing for me is there must be an end to the expansion of sacrificial zones. This is whether for dirty energy or for green energy, we have to be very, very conscious of what is happening at the crime scenes where these resources are being extracted. And then to end on a positive note, I want to recommend that we take to heart the wise saying of Che Guevara, who said, "Be reasonable, demand the impossible."
Thank you. So, in one of the other sessions, Matt, we are looking at the resisting the war machine and the power of capital. In other sessions, this is the whole challenge. So many different sessions all trying to thread this together. I want to just say, as War on One, we've looked and been working, of course, how do we try and do this? How do we look at making sure that we have a justice and equitable transition that not only meets the requirements equitably of the 1.5, but tackles global inequality in the systems and ensures planetary limits. And I think this is where there is immense hope for us as a movement. Not just to talk, I think, switching our conversation away from less, but better. Being able to, what does everybody living in dignity look like? And that, of course, the answer to both from a climate perspective and an inequality perspective is universal public services, is social protection, is living wages. It is making energy and food a right, taking out the profit motive, and being able to be equitably shared. But it's also about envisaging a different way of living, that it can be better, more healthier. And during the COVID pandemic, we all realized what was important in our lives was our families and our communities, our green space. And this kind of weaving together a very much more positive vision is the only way that we defeat the forces of the far right. I think if we reduce our fights, we allow the right to weaponize climate against inequality. When we are the ones who are looking at that and saying, actually, without tackling climate change, it will widen and deepen inequality. And telling and identifying who are the ones who are responsible, that the elites, big corporations, who is it who's getting wealthier and wealthier? During the COVID pandemic, workers lost 3.6 trillion in wages. The billionaire class made 3.7 billion in increased profits. There is no lack of money to be able to transform these, no lack of money. And what our challenge here in the global north is to try and begin to connect our fights. So when we're defending the NHS here, we're calling for a global NHS. When we fight for living wages here, we're fighting for £15 an hour here, then at least we should be fighting for $15 a day in the global south through the supply chains. If we fight, and we know that many people in this country now struggle to feed themselves, and we have a massive food bank, These are opportunities for us to say it's not either or. It's not a fight of a hierarchy of working people in the global north against working people in the global south. This is a collective struggle now, and that requires new internationalism, requires new solidarity. But fundamentally, none of this is possible without tackling our rigged global economy. We heard in the morning session it perfectly works for those that it's been set up for. We have to transform that. And that's one of the big questions that we within War on Want and our allies and partners have been grappling with. We call our vision a global Green New Deal, people in the global south, the Ecosocial Pact, well-being, living well, Ubuntu, many, many different words, all for the same fight. And that, I think, is a unique moment in human history, that there is a fight that can be fought in every place and have a collective framework, whilst recognizing, of course, that there are very, very different realities on the ground. We've run a little bit over. We're going to move into the next section. It's going to start at 12:30.